Meet Jon Watts, the maestro of media mayhem who's surfing the tsunami of TV measurement with the poise of a seasoned pro. In a world that's buzzing with upfront frenzies, canned lions just around the bend, and the relentless pulse of innovation, Jon is the calm in the storm, dissecting disruption with a sharp wit and a keen eye. Today on the Adotat Show, we're peeling back the layers of advertising's hottest topics, from data dilemmas to privacy puzzles. Hang on to your hats. This isn't your average industry rundown.
Deserve to win when it matters most. Facing multi-billion-dollar bet the company litigation? No problem. That's why we're here. Troutman Amin, LLP is a true legal powerhouse.
Buckle up for some irreverent insights, cheeky questions, and a dash of chutzpah. Let's dive in. Jon, how's the weather in your world today, and what big things are occupying your brain space?
Well, hey, Pesach, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's a busy time, I suspect, for the entire market. Obviously, there's a world that's being steadily did all around us, and I feel day to day, pretty much everyone I speak to is grappling with that in the media and advertising space. But it's also upfront season. The Cannes Lions is just around the corner. And then, of course, it'll be into the summer break before we know it. So it feels like a furiously busy time of year.
So what's been keeping you up at night? And I don't mean late night TV binges.
Great question. Not much keeps me up at night, but I know amongst the SIM membership base, the work we're doing at the moment really is looking at three big areas or issues. So number one, we have a multi-currency transition underway in the US market. It's a steady transition which has been underway for some time, but the upfront's always a moment when that debate becomes a critical one. And we spend time thinking long and hard about how that really is operationalized, what the benefits look like, how different vendors interact with the buy side and the sell side. Of course, the sellers are all experiencing in the US market significant pressures, but they're also innovating at speed. And the upfronts have seen some really exciting changes and announcements, particularly, I think, around data collaboration, attribution, different types of targeting, and so on and so forth. Second big thing that keeps us up awake at night, I guess, is the inevitable set of issues around data quality, trust, and privacy. So we're building a TV and video marketplace, of course, on data sets. TV's inventory has become far more data enabled, but I think we've now learned that not all data is the same. I always draw the analogy with the Jenga tower in The Big Short. There's obviously AAA tranche data at the top and some junk bond stuff at the bottom. And I think a lot of the work underway at the moment is to try and provide buyers with greater transparency about what they're transacting against. And then the third issue, I suppose, in terms of what keeps me up awake at night, is making sure that different areas of the marketplace are well served. So in the US market, again, for example, there's a huge local marketplace, which has been largely outside of the multi-currency, but has very distinctive measurement needs and requirements. We have a set of people who are content research specialists who really want to understand the performance of their channels, their streaming services, their program, who really want a market-wide snapshot of the landscape. And many of them argue that their needs, the use cases that they're trying to address with their stakeholders internally have not been well addressed. So that's the third issue we look at is making sure that we carry the entire marketplace forwards rather than just a few specialized use cases as a small number of big businesses. It's a big old market, and I think that's part of the joy of it. I think we have to try and hang on to that as much as possible.
So anything this year that made you think, wow, I didn't see that coming?
Great question. I was really struck by the growth of live and of streaming together, the kind of ongoing development of sports and live content in the streaming space. I think it's been a really interesting development. When you look at traditional linear TV ratings in the US market, the proportion of those mass audience which are driven by sports is extraordinary. NFL is a huge driver of ratings, but we're seeing more and more live or as live content being delivered into streaming platforms. And I think that's a really interesting development. I think it enables lots of interesting things, but also creates some measurement challenge. I think you may have seen the Nielsen Amazon discussion about incorporating first-party streaming data around Amazon's live sports portfolio into the Nielsen measurement offering. And there was something of a kerfuffle about that and how it was going to work in practice. I think we're going to see a lot more of that as we try to navigate this new landscape of services. I was on a call earlier today with somebody who's very deep in the FAST landscape. I do feel we have to take in Occam's razor principle when it comes to the number of acronyms we proliferated in our market.
Right.
But fast measurement is still an enormous challenge. It's a huge number of channels. Roku alone carries hundreds of channels, which are essentially live services. Measuring all of those is a deeply challenging activity if you want to understand content and audiences. If you're just counting ad impressions served to a screen, it's a different thing. But if we want to understand who's watching these services and where the audiences are and how the consumer journey across different content types and services is happening, we have a lot of work still to do.
Tired of ads that suck? So are we. Expect better ads. Origin Advertising Remastered.
What acronym would you get rid of?
Fast.
Fast? It serves no purpose?
Not to my mind particularly. I'm not sure it stands for anything. I mean, we have FAST, we have AVODs, we have virtual MVPDs. Interestingly, a lot of people I talk to in pay TV marketplace argue that we should stop counting the MVPD separate from just MVPD. They're all just pay TV services delivering channels by a slightly different delivery platform. But yeah, I feel you have to assume that unless there's a really strong, distinct need or requirement for a new acronym, we should 100% not have a new acronym.
So you took over from Jane Clark a few years ago. How has the Sim throne felt? Is it more Game of Thrones or a comfy armchair?
That's interesting. I would say it's neither, really. I don't, as far as I can tell, have a rampaging suite of other thrones. The throne, if I can put it that way. Game of Thrones was pretty bloody, as far as I recall, and it's not that kind of marketplace. No, I mean, in all honesty, it's been one of the greatest privileges and honors of my life and an enormous pleasure. I hugely enjoy it. There's a great sense that we're able to bring together companies from across the ecosystem to do really important work. So I often say to people that SIM is a very unique body. It's non-partisan in the sense that we are trying to embrace the entire ecosystem, buy side and sell side. We're bound by the ARF's principles of scientific rigor, objectivity and impartiality. We're generally trying to find which work for the entire ecosystem. And that's a really important position, I think, to have. We need a body like that. We obviously have a lot of work to do. It's not an easy role to play. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can collaborate and fit in with the wider ecosystem. And I'm thinking particularly of bodies like the VAB, the MRC, the IAB Tech Lab, and so on and so forth. We have really good, close working relationships with them. But the US has a lot of different bodies, and you have to work with them to deliver real impact and sustainable, meaningful change and improvement. And that's where we spend a lot of our time focusing.
What was the biggest surprise you encountered stepping into Jane's heels?
The biggest surprise? That's an interesting question. I'm not sure there were many surprises. I'd understood the lay of the land, and obviously I'd known Jane for some years and was very familiar with Sim's work. I think what surprised me most was the appetite for growth. So when I started at Sim in 2022, we went into a 6-month strategic review. And that wasn't because there was any issue with what had gone before. It was just that any body which has been run by one person for getting on for 15 years in a marketplace which is changing very rapidly has from time to time to step back and take a look at the big picture and ask if there are things we should do differently, if there are new things we should start doing, and so on and so forth. And there were some significant changes that we introduced as a result of that review. There are 3 I'd point to. Number 1, we broadened out SIM's remit and mission. Historically, SIM had been focused on cross-platform TV measurement. It had really been founded in the 2000s by the major networks and agency groups to look very specifically at how to make TV measurement better. In 2022, it was clear that the world of television had become much shinier, more diverse, clearly more fragmented, more competitive, more innovative, and SIM's remit needed to change to embrace that wider ecosystem. So we now describe our mission as being to cultivate and support improvements, best practices, and innovations in 3 key areas. 1 is measurement and currency development, so how media is planned, bought, and sold. Secondly is data collaboration and enablement, so the use of data across the ecosystem in clean rooms to support addressable segment formation, all of the issues around identity resolution and data quality, these sorts of things. And then the third part of our mission is the use and application of new metrics, so new ways of understanding the value of media, things like attention, quality, attribution, and outcomes. Second big change that we introduced was with that new mission, we went out and tried to grow our membership base. My feeling very strongly is that innovation comes from the creative actions that happens between companies with very different backgrounds, different legacies, different capabilities, different skill sets. And we've been able to cultivate lots of those discussions with our new and expanded membership base. We now count just over 100 members, a very diverse range of companies, ranging from some of the largest companies in the world, like Google, to the major TV networks, down to a long tail of streamers, measurement and data companies, programmatic platforms, MVPDs, CTV OEMs, and so on and so forth. Final
So
change.
Sorry, go ahead.
The final big change we introduced was just to expand our program. So with new mission, more members, we've dramatically expanded the range of activities. This year alone, we've increased our commissioning volume. So we have a lot of projects, which I'm sure we'll come and talk about in a moment, on the boil at the moment, things which are big, important projects, we think. We've expanded our working groups in a really interesting and important way. And we've also grown our event program. We've just announced our first major European summit, which will be in London on Monday, December the 8th, or December 9th, I think it is. Just before the Future TV Ad Forum Global, which is run by AdWanted, which is one of the most august and interesting events. My friend Justin Lebon set it up many years ago, and it's gone from strength to strength with Steve and the team over there, previously at MediaTel, of course. So we're setting up a summit in Europe the day before that, which we hope will be a great gathering of Europeans, Americans, and the Brits, the Brexited Brits, to talk about improvements in measurement, data, and so on and so forth.
So speaking of projects, what's been the most exciting project you worked on? Something that made you jump out of bed with excitement this year? And we mean real, honest to goodness, can't wait to start excitement.
That's a good question. So lots of our projects, I think, are exciting and important for different stakeholders. I think some of the work we're doing at the moment looking at the future role and value of panels. So we recently published a study that looks specifically at this issue. We've been finding from our discussions with that there was a real lack of consensus about the role and value of measurement panels in the marketplace in the US. And it was great to have the opportunity to produce something really authoritative, particularly to look at the extent to which certain panel use cases can be substituted in big data sets and machine learning, for example. And I'm hoping we sort of set some of that debate to bed, at least for the next few years. I think the other project that the other team that we've worked with that we found hugely valuable are our friends over at TruthSet. TruthSet is a really interesting company who use various techniques to assess a lot of Bayesian logic to try and understand the value of data, the quality of data. And we've done one big study with them last year, and we're currently putting together a next study. Last year, we looked at what's called a HEM, a household to email address match rate. And they were able to assess the likely probability that different matches were accurate. And unsurprisingly, they found that there are a lot of large databases of email addresses which are being poorly matched to households.
Right.
And that was a really interesting learning because it's huge.
Do we know why?
Yeah, there's various different reasons. The biggest areas of uncertainty are to do with, first of all, certain demos. So if you think about the difference between, say, a 22 to 25-year-old who probably doesn't own their own house, so they may be more transient, they may be moving from rented property to rented property, possibly sharing with other people, a floating cast of characters. They might be changing job, they might be changing city. So there's lots of impermanence around their email address and their physical postal address, compared to, say, a 55-year-old who probably owns their own household, maybe unstable, possibly heading towards retirement, but much less fluff in their email addresses and their household postal address than younger demos. So that was one issue. The second big issue that came out of the study was that we've incentivized data companies on scale, not quality.
Right.
And there are no industry data hygiene rules for retiring old email addresses. So let's say, Pesach, you'd set up and we're running a data business and you've been out and you've aggregated email addresses from different sources, and you probably had some initial quality check. But some of those email addresses may be months, years, even decades old. I counted up the number of email addresses I've had in my life, and it's in the significant double digits. I've now gravitated towards
just from the various companies alone.
Exactly. You change employment, you get a new email address. And the process for retiring those old email addresses is not well established. So there's a huge gulf between companies with really good data hygiene who check the veracity and accuracy of an email address versus those who are just incentivized on scale and have built up these huge databases but never retire anything old. They never clean it out.
So how do you see this project shaping the future of SIM?
That particular project? I think what it really raised in terms of importance for us was this notion of trying to find institutional arrangements that can underpin data transparency. Back to the AAA versus junk bond analogy. it's very clear that the future of media is largely being built on different data sets. And there are lots of those data sets. What we don't yet always have in the market are clear ways of signaling the quality of that data. And we're starting to believe that going forwards, to really unlock the full potential of this industry, but also to give buyers and sellers confidence, we need to think again about the institutional arrangements that underpin transparency. So we are huge fans of the work that the MRC does here in the US. So the MRC, for those who don't know, is the Media Ratings Council, and it plays a really important role in accrediting measurement vendors for their data sets, for their methods. And it has a long and rigorous process. And when you talk to buyers, almost every buyer we talk to is hugely positive about the MRC process. It means that every advertiser doesn't have to do the same due diligence themselves. If they know that the MRC has accredited something, they can have a lot of trust that what they're transacting against is pretty good quality. The challenge, of course, is that not every company is MRC accredited. The process takes time, and it doesn't cover the quality of data sets. So the question we're starting to ask is, can we identify institutional arrangements which would give buyers more confidence in the quality of the data they're transacting against, but also sellers? We're right at the beginning of thinking about how that could work in practice, but I do think there are techniques and methodologies which will allow us to deliver greater transparency. So in other words, Pesach, you might be looking to reach 834 auto intenders, in 5 states. And you could transact against some expensive but small data sets in the kind of AAA tranche. It'll be expensive on a kind of per lead basis, but you're transacting against a quality database. Or you could look to buy against a broader, more amorphous database that probably includes some junk bond identity in there. But you might get some people who perhaps haven't been picked up as intenders yet. You might be building for the future. It's not clear that all advertising is wasted, even if it doesn't reach the intended target. You might influence someone who becomes an auto-intender 6 months down the road. Now, again, those data sets might have different prices. They might have different, but it seems positive to me to give you the choice of knowing what you transact against.
So moving on, how is SIM steering this roller coaster of TV measurement transitions without losing its lunch?
Good question. So we're a non-profit organization funded by dues from our members. That's our overwhelmingly most important source of funding. So we very carefully plan our annual program using what we anticipate to be those dues. And we're not risking money. We are a well-funded organization that can cover a significant body of work. The bigger issue for me is about impact. And that's something we're doing a lot of thinking about at the moment. Nobody wants to be just another talking shop where the great and the good gather but don't deliver any meaningful change. Equally, I don't think anyone who believes that pumping out white papers is going to change anything is talking about the right ballpark. You have to think very carefully about how you deliver meaningful, sustainable change in a marketplace, particularly one that's as big and as complex as the US market. So we're spending a lot.
What's your biggest hope for this new measurement landscape?
I think competition is going to deliver a range of benefits. I think we're going to see a broader range of products and services, which I think will be differentiated. I think we'll have different vendors delivering quite different capabilities and offerings into the market. Secondly, I think we'll see a faster pace of innovation. Competition is positive from that point of view. And I think thirdly, we should see a more robust set of pricing models. Competition in most markets drives prices down. And I think in the measurement landscape, the combination of those things will be a huge positive. I think we're already seeing an enormous wave of innovation in the space. You think about the way that different vendors, everybody from Innovid to LiveRamp to Nielsen to Comscore to iSpot to VideoAmp to Kachava to EDO, this extraordinary range of companies who are delivering quite different types of solution are helping buyers and sellers to really understand and appreciate the value of their media and to measure the effectiveness of their campaigns, to plan better. It's a great time in a way. It is a confusing time. I mean, navigating between all these different solutions is not straightforward. But we're seeing tremendous progress, and we're very positive about that.
Any shiny new toys in the measurement world that has your members buzzing like kids in a candy store?
I think we're seeing a lot of interest at the moment in outcomes. So I'm sure we've all been at conferences where somebody from an agency will stand up and say, what buyers really want is outcomes. They want ROI. They want to attribute value. And I think we are now seeing some really interesting solutions in and around that space. I'm personally very impressed by the work that our friends at EDO, the Edward Norton data business,
Right.
have been doing.
Yeah, just spoke to Kevin a few weeks ago.
Right. Yeah, Kevin is one of the great guys of the industry, and I think they're doing really interesting work. We're very impressed by their team. We're hoping to do some work with them in the future, but they've been a great addition to our membership. You probably saw their partnership they announced recently with MasterCard and Paramount. I think that's indicative of the kind of innovations which we think are hugely valuable in the market at the moment.
How do the new solutions compare to the old guard like Nielsen?
Different. I think it's interesting. I mean, it was very fashionable in our industry to bash Nielsen for a period. I think Nielsen does something really powerful and valuable. You know, standing up and maintaining a panel in the US market is hideously complex and difficult. You've got to cover 50 states, hundreds of DMAs. You've got most extraordinarily fragmented landscape of services. You obviously have churn in panelists. You've got changes in equipment. You've got to do a whole set of things really, really well from a technical and operational point of view to stand up and deliver reliable. And I think Nielsen has done that incredibly successfully for decades. Now, they are innovating at pace now. Nielsen One, I think, will be a really powerful solution that will generate many, many customers. But I think they're doing something slightly different to what Videamp and iSpot and others are doing, and Comscore. You know, those are companies that play in the currency space, but I think they've built their solutions in different ways, and they deliver slightly different things that some buyers clearly want. So I think we're going to see a kind of competitive but complementary marketplace for solutions. Good example, iSpot recently presented some really fascinating research looking at second-by-second measurement of ad breaks in sports programming. Now, historically in the US marketplace, we've looked at average pod viewing. So we haven't been able to look at different viewing at different ads within a single pod. iSpot are measuring second by second, and what they've been able to explore is the fall off in viewing for later pods in an ad break. And there are some really interesting insights that they've been able to bring to the market, which illustrate what different vendors with different solutions can offer.
So you recently had this SIM Summit, am I correct in saying that?
Yes, that's
What
right.
is the biggest, what would you say is the latest and greatest from the SIM Summit that's got you feeling like a kid on a Hanukkah morning?
Interestingly phrased question. SIM runs 3 major US summits each year, SIM East, SIM West, and then SIM Summit, which is our annual 2-day flagship event in New York. SIM East happened a few months back. We were delighted to be hosted by our friends at Paramount Advertising at their fabulous HQ in Times Square. And we had a day of debate and discussion in a really great venue with some really fascinating speakers and presenters. I think there were lots of really interesting insights coming out of the session. A couple of highlights from me. We had a panel with the CEOs of Nielsen, Comscore, Videamp, and iSpot talking about the evolution of the measurement space. And that I thought was really interesting. There had been a previous panel with the same 4 executives at the IAB ALM event, which was also really good, but it was a short panel and they didn't get into the detail on some issues. But we had a really good discussion, which I thought was really insightful and helpful. And you can see how these 4 companies are doing slightly different things in the marketplace. We also previewed 2 new papers that SIM will be publishing later this year and making available to the industry. A piece by Josh Chasen, previously at Videoamp, and Albert Lau, who exited Omnicom a little while ago, who will be talking about measurement. So they are going to look at the 6 biggest methodological challenges that underpin measurement solutions and look at how we can solve for them. And that, I think, will be a really important industry action, a chance to really just take stock of where we are and think about how we improve and address some of the challenges that every measurement vendor grapples with. We also had a paper presented by a programmatic consultant, Emily Palmer, a good friend based in Portland, who's doing a piece for us, which is a diagnostic review, looking at the flow of measurement and metrics through the programmatic ecosystem for CTV. And again, she's halfway through the research, but is identifying some really interesting challenges and opportunities for improvement. Things like contextual definitions. A surprisingly large amount of video inventory in the programmatic space is still transacted against but we don't yet have a really well-established mass market taxonomy for defining different genres. So there's opportunities of improvement in that space. So those are the kinds of things that we like to preview at Sim East, which I thought made for a really interesting set of discussions.
So how is SIM helping differentiate between currency and measurement in today's market? Because I've met quite a few people who aren't certain what the difference is.
It's a really good question. I tend to find that the answers in this camp fall into two different buckets. Bucket one, there's a set of people who will argue that currency is simply whatever two parties choose to transact on.
Right.
In other words, anything can be a currency. I think there's a second growing school of opinion which says that there are certain measurement solutions which we can deem to be currency grade. So the US JIC, for example, published a statement of currency requirements, a statement of requirements for currency grade measurement then a little while back. And they state a number of criteria which buyers and sellers would like to see measurement vendors who want to be considered currency grade adhere to. And there are things about currency and change control and edit rules and all sorts of things. I think currency is complex. I think the reality is that we are looking to transact billions and billions of dollars of ad spend. It's meaningful, viable, comprehensive measurement solution, but deliver really good granular insights. So I think we should take currency seriously. So I think in answer to the question, I tend to sit at the more process-orientated, auditable end of the currency spectrum. I think it's complex, deservedly so, and we should take that complexity seriously.
Any myths that you're busting about it?
About currency? I remain profoundly skeptical that attention is going to be a currency anytime soon.
Why is that?
I think three reasons. So number one, the currency, the attention associated with the delivery of an ad depends upon lots of different factors. And not all of them are in the control of either the buyer or the seller. So if I'm a major TV network, for example, and you deliver an ad to me, and I think the ad is not a great ad, it might deliver very poor levels of attention. Do I turn the ad away? At the moment, that doesn't happen. And equally, airtime is regulated. So there are certain things that have to be the case when an ad is aired. So it's difficult for any one party, or for two parties even, to take responsibility and to agree in attention. I think secondly, we're still at a relatively early stage in the measurement of attention. So there's work to be done standardizing attention and giving buyers confidence in the metrics that they wish to transact against. There's some great work being done by my friend and colleague, Angeline Eng at the IAB, who's been leading the IAB's attention task force, which I think is doing really important work on trying to standardize attention. And that will be work that they'll be delivering with the MRC. I think the third reason is that when we do work looking at the way that different vendors try to assess the attention associated with different creative or different media placements, there's quite a lot of variation. So most of these vendors are not MRC accredited. There's some opacity about their methodologies in some cases. Often they're working with quite small samples. So I think there's work to be done to build out really high quality, robust attention solutions. I'm confident that work is happening, and there are vendors who are really ahead of the curve, I think, in lots of these areas. But there's still more work to be done, I think, to provide transparency about the differences between different vendors and about the quality of their outputs.
Do you think there's any future with the eye tracking measurements?
I think I would personally like to see more work done to unpack the relationship between eye tracking and attention. So we know that attention is a neuroscientifically complex phenomenon. You know, Daniel Kahneman has written extensively, as just one example, about some of that complexity. And we know that the human mind is a very difficult thing to understand. We're here in 2024 and we still don't have a good and widely accepted philosophy or theory of mind. We don't quite know how the consciousness that you and I believe ourselves strongly to have distills.
Yeah, I've read every Steven Pinker book and I still have no idea what's going on.
I mean, I think you and me both. Now, eye tracking, I think, by contrast, definitely has a role to play. I think especially in the digital space where you have multiple creative units on a page, and just trying to understand, did someone see my banner ad lurking on the bottom right of the page, is useful and important. I think in the TV space, for example, and SIM is predominantly focused on TV and video. We do plan to start looking at other media next year, 2025, but this year we're all about TV and video. I think there's more work to be done to understand the relationship between eye tracking on a big TV screen following an ad around and what that means from an attention point of view. I don't think there's a simple read across.
Regarding addressable advertising and targeting, it's obviously the peanut butter and jelly of modern media. How do you see them evolving?
Going forwards,
Yeah. What's your take on where it's headed?
I think we're going to head to a place in which some level of addressability and targeting will continue to scale up. So it's worth saying, of course, that today in the US market, the majority of TV is not addressably delivered. So I often think we get confused about the difference between addressability and targeting. Most TV ad spend, the vast majority of it, of course, is targeted. You have a view of the intended and you position your ad on a schedule, on a channel, on a service accordingly, depending on the nature of ad audience. Addressability, of course, is the ability to deliver a different ad to different audiences, to address an ad to a particular subsegment. So we sometimes talk about this thing called data-driven linear. And data-driven linear, which I sometimes slightly glibly remark is just what we used to call media planning. Data-driven linear just means, of course, that you're trying to find a channel or a program or a service where your target audience indexes highly, against which you'll then deliver your ad. It's different to addressable. I think almost all media is targeted in the TV and video space. There's very few people just buying random scatter buys. That clearly doesn't happen. But I think what we're going to see developing is ever more sophisticated ways of really delivering addressable, highly targeted ads using incrementality measurement, using MMMs, using real-time optimization and AI tools to really think about the sequencing and positioning and frequency and reach of those ads. I think we have a way to go, but I think we are making good progress in that space. But I see just ever-growing sophistication. It's worth saying there are still some things today which are extremely hard to do. So if you want to plan and buy a campaign that includes some national linear ad spend, some local top-up in certain DMAs or certain cities or urban areas, some data-driven linear for some reason, some addressable, some CTV and streaming, and then maybe you also want to use an ad buy on YouTube just to build out the final reach and frequency for light TV viewers. Threading all of that together today, from a measurement point of view, is extraordinary. We don't have measurement solutions that will easily deliver that cross-platform reach and frequency, which of course buyers want. And that's why the ANA is investing in its CMM initiative, same as our friends over in the UK at ISBA with Project Origin.
So what's the potential for consumer backlash?
It's a really good question. I find the industry is very polarized on this point. So obviously there's a sense that many consumers are unaware of how their data is being used. But I certainly talk to senior execs on the sell side who will say, if I tell you that I want to use some of your personal data, in return for which I'm going to deliver you more relevant ads, and I'm going to let you watch great content for free or for a very low price. For the vast majority of consumers, that's a pretty good value exchange. I think where we have some work to do is to, one, communicate that value exchange more clearly to consumers. I mean, I'm not sure that everyone is aware that in return for getting more relevant, targeted ads, you're going to get great content. We don't communicate that very clearly. I think the second issue where we have some work to do is in thinking about the difference between individuals and households. I may want to get more relevant ads, and in return for that, I'll watch some great TV at a cheaper price. But my wife, my partner, my children, other people in my household might have a very different view. We have to make it easier, I think, for consumers to manage their own privacy, the use of their data within TV households. TV is a really complex aggregation platforms, and we've distributed the inventory rights quite widely. Managing that from a consumer point of view is still complex.
I want to change lanes a little bit here and talk about personal stuff. So spill the beans. Where did you pop out? What is your origin story, superhero style? Were you bitten by a radioactive accountant, or did you just emerge fully formed from the sea of spreadsheets?
I'm delighted to say that I did not emerge fully formed. No, sir, I'm a thinly disguised Brit, as you can probably tell. I was born and bred in London and spent my childhood there, apart from a brief foray to live in Brunei as a very young child, which I remember reasonably well. It was a very interesting time. But then
the Sultan of Brunei actually his son hit on my sister like 25 years ago.
Oh, how
funny.
Like
5 wives or something at the time. She was in the Saudi Arabia at a event, and the guy invited her to his room
I'm
or something.
embarrassed to say in that case, but I once shook the man's hand. In Brunei, there's an annual festival, an
Right.
Islamic festival, where essentially the entire male population of Brunei gathers, or those who can make it, gathers in the grounds of one of the Sultan's palaces. And everyone eats a meal of sort of rice and fish and so on and so forth. And then 80,000 people queue up and shake the Sultan's hand. And as a young child, I was one of those. But probably a little bit before the unfortunate incident that you're referring to.
She was trying to sell them jet planes at the time. So,
but then I went to university and I studied social theory and philosophy, and then I got halfway through a PhD, and I had one of those classic moments of Damascus revelation where I suddenly thought, I do not want to be an academic. I didn't want to do it, which I wish I realized slightly sooner. But I wandered into the careers office, and there was a little handwritten note. It was the first time I'd ever been in the careers office, and there was a little handwritten note saying, media consultant seeks analyst. And I thought, my father worked for the BBC for most of his career, and I thought media sounds interesting. So I picked up the phone, and 2 weeks later, I was working as an analyst with a McKinsey consultant who hadn't liked being at McKinsey very much, but he loved film and media and entertainment. And I kind of learnt the ropes with him. And then I moved across and spent 20 years in consulting firms, basically, which I loved. Always focused on media and advertising. Had the great pleasure and privilege to travel around the world with different clients, and spent quite long periods working in different parts of Europe, in Asia, APAC, South America, which was always fascinating. And it was such a golden time in media. I mean, you had the growth of the internet, you have the transition from analog to digital television, you have the rollout of 2G, 3G, 4G, now 5G, ever faster internet speed. My kind of consulting career really did coincide with that time when all of these extraordinarily well-known internet brands that now we live and breathe daily were growing, and a lot of companies that subsequently fell by the wayside were also part of the market. People probably forget things like Friendster and Aimster and Grokster and all these other social networks that didn't quite make it in the way that Facebook, now Meta, did.
Reflecting on your work with Sky and European markets, what key lessons did you learn that apply today?
Sorry, can you say that again? I didn't catch you.
What lessons did you learn for working with Sky?
So I had the great pleasure to work with Sky on numerous occasions. They were one of the more extremely pay TV in the UK marketplace, and then subsequently in Europe as well. Sky, I think, did a number of things extraordinarily well. So, number one, they remained pretty focused on the right set of priorities. The kind of golden period of pay TV adoption in the UK market was also around the time that lots of other opportunities were opening up, in terms of internet services and music streaming and other things that could easily have been a diversion. What I learned from Sky Principle was the importance of being incredibly focused on the key things the business is trying to achieve, rather than being distracted and sprawling. I think the second thing that Sky did brilliantly was operational excellence. I mean, the quality of Sky's customer service, the quality of its strategic thinking, the care with which it built out and managed its customer relationships, its technology, its products, its services was extraordinary. I know following the Comcast acquisition, that was something that hugely impressed the folks over at Comcast. And it was largely down to competition. Murdoch was an interesting character, of course, but he really understood what it took to succeed in a competitive marketplace. And of course, in the UK, at the time, you were predominantly competing against free-to-air television. And the UK has a very strong free-to-air ecosystem, with the BBC and a portfolio of public and private commercially funded stations that competed fiercely for audiences. And to convince people to pay quite significant sums of money against that amazing free-to-air offering, you have to do something high quality, compelling, unique. And Sky achieved that and delivered it with great operational aplomb.
What European innovation do you think the American market should adopt?
Public service funding for TV and news services.
Right.
I'm not sure it qualifies as innovative any longer. It's obviously been around for many, many decades now. We're heading towards the 100th anniversary of the BBC, of course. It's interesting. In Europe, I see clearly that there's significant political debate and discussion about all manner of topics, unsurprisingly, just as there is over here in the US. But I think Europe has managed to come to terms with freedom of speech and the importance of news media for the functioning of a successful democracy in a way that I'm not always sure America has. It seems strange to me that it requires a lawsuit by a voting machine, Dominion,
Right.
to hold a major news broadcaster to account for misleading on air that could give some viewers cause to believe that the election was stolen, that the voting machines were rigged, that there was fraud. Now, I don't believe that any of that was true at all, but it was a set of statements routinely trotted out on a major US news channel that Dominion then held them to account, and a fine was levied of $750 million approximately. Now,
so if I remember right, the BBC charges every household about 150 quid per TV or so?
The BBC is funded by a license fee, which is levied on TV households. The BBC takes that charter very, very seriously. In other words, they try very hard to provide something for everyone. They have standards of impartiality and objectivity. They don't always get it right. I think it's very hard to be a contemporary news organization without dropping the ball occasionally. Of course they do. But I think in the round, by and large, that system of public service broadcasting has served European markets very well. And I think over here, PBS does great work, but obviously its funding is a fraction of what its European counterparts receive. And I think it's led to a somewhat more indirectly, but it has contributed to a more polarized debate. I'm not sure there's any source of truth in the US news market that's widely agreed upon. We have a very polarized political estate here in the US. And I think a well-funded public service media with fact-checking and standards of truth and truthiness can play a role in trying to mediate some of the more extreme poles of that debate. And I think that's important. I think democracies rely upon a well-informed citizenship.
So who's been your Yoda in this industry, the one mentor who turned you from Padawan to a Jedi?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not sure I've achieved Jedi status by any stretch of imagination. I mean, one of the things I've always enjoyed, throughout my professional career has been able to spend time with people who have, in almost all cases, been much smarter than I have, with far more experience and expertise. But I'm quite curious. I enjoy talking to different parts of the industry, and I've been lucky enough over the course of my career to spend a lot of time talking to some fascinating people. To call out a few names, I struck up a friendship and professional relationship with a gentleman called Mike Darcy, who was at Sky, and he was head of strategy for Sky during its long period of growth. He then became COO in the kind of mid-2000s. And Mike was incredibly kind and generous with his time, but also one of the most insightful, thoughtful executives when it comes to media and advertising that I've ever spent time with. He has an extraordinary brain and talent for thinking strategically about everything from sports rights to pay TV services to the future of streaming.
Any memorable advice they gave you?
Mike
do or do not, there is no try, that type of stuff?
Yeah, nothing that immediately springs to mind. I think one thing that Mike and indeed others I've worked with have always been very clear about is that your strategy is only as good as your ability to articulate it and to support it with evidence, and to make it seem practical and meaningful and realistic. I'm always amazed at how many great thinkers in our industry just don't write very well, and the brilliance of their thinking is lost in the poverty of their communication. So I think taking the time to express yourself clearly and thinking through carefully how best to articulate what you're really trying to say in a way which is both compelling and persuasive, but also clear and articulate, is absolutely worth the time. It was the people who emphasized the importance of good writing who really made a difference to me. There was a gentleman I worked with at one of my first consulting firms called Kip Meek. And I remember sitting with Kip as he presented a very complex vision of a venture capitalist who'd made an investment in a business which hadn't been performing very well. And he walked through this beautifully constructed argument until he came to a slide which just had 2 bullets on it. It said, therefore, you have 2 choices. 1, close it. 2, restructure. And there was sort of a silence as he led to it, but it was like a crescendo in his argument, which was so beautifully delivered that everybody, of course, chose to restructure, and that was the next part of the presentation. But I like the fact he had, I've always hated those slides where there's 7,000 exhibits kind of screaming for space, and you're trying to go, what is this telling me? If you can't write clearly, if you can't tell me what your idea is, I probably won't understand your idea.
What do you think of the new season of Doctor Who?
Do you know, I haven't seen it yet. I've heard good things.
It's interesting.
it was definitely due yet another reboot. I mean, it's funny. I grew up with Tom Baker many
me
years.
too.
Yes,
Gummy babies.
many years ago. So at the time, I remember hiding behind the sofa and finding Doctor Who often quite terrifying, even though almost all of it seemed to be filmed in a gravel pit somewhere outside.
That or the BBC basement. That's what I always joke about. Like whenever they have a ship, it's like this. It was like the basement of the BBC. Didn't matter how far in the future it was. They had steam pipes.
Absolutely. I remember there was a lot of time spent on. I think the Daleks' homeworld is called Skaros, and I remember watching episodes where Davros is kind of inventing the Daleks, and I remember that was a real highlight. But I haven't seen the latest version, the kind of new Disney co-production joint venture yet, but I've heard good things about it.
Yeah, I saw the first 3. It was pretty enjoyable. I think they're going to go a little bit overboard on some stuff, but to the American audience, I think want to be a little bit more emotional and feely than Doctor Who usually is.
I do think more importantly, and this is something that we lose sight of, if you are someone who watches television, there has never been a best time to be alive. I mean, the range and quality of incredible programming made an extraordinary range of different budgets that's available to you on demand across numerous services, most of which are pretty reasonably priced, is extraordinary. We live in an era of many riches. TV has never been better. It looks great. There's more choice than ever before. We have more control over it. There's opportunities for all sorts of storytellers to tell their stories, in video, on TV, and in film. I think it's a golden age.
Before we go, I'd like to ask people if you could send yourself a time-traveling text message. When you started in the industry, what piece of advice would you give yourself?
Move to the US 10 years before you did.
Why?
I love it over here. I think this is one of the most inventive, dynamic, certainly one of the most globally successful, media and entertainment markets in the world. And it's been one of the great privileges, as I said, being part of SIM and having the chance to work with quite so many bright, brilliant, enthusiastic, talented people who really understand this industry at a time of tremendous change. I'm a Brit. I'll always be British. Many of my friends and family and companies I've worked with remain in the UK. But the UK has had a tough time over the last few years. It's a challenging market for pretty much everybody. It's very hard to point to companies that are having a great run at this point in time. It's just it's a tricky market. The economy is challenged at this point in time. I think the US has its challenges, undoubtedly, but it also has this great sense of opportunity and of risk take and of a willingness to encourage creative people in different disciplines and areas, a sense of adventure, which I find hugely appealing. I've enjoyed it.
And just like that, we've reached the end of another thrilling ride on the AddoTat Show. Big thanks to Jon Watts for dropping by and spilling the tea on everything from media metrics to the madness of measurement. Remember, in the relentless whirlwind of advertising, if you're not a little dizzy, you're probably doing it wrong. Huge thanks to Troutman Amin LLP, masters of navigating the tricky waters of legal compliance in advertising, and Origin, the wizards behind those captivating, innovative CTV ads that keep our screens lively. Your support not only keeps the lights on and the printers running at AddoTat, but also ensures our coffee stays hot enough to fuel these fiery discussions. Thank you for helping us stir up the media pot with some serious style. Until next time, keep disrupting, or at least keep pretending you know what all those acronyms stand for. And always remember our mantra: stay curious, stay bold, and know more than you did yesterday.